Let me move to you.
Should I take this?
If you want it, yeah. Yeah, you can take it. Yeah, why not?
I'll put it back on when we switch back to Spanish.
Okay. So how are you doing, Natalie, today?
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And I've never been in Chile before. It's a beautiful country, and it's interesting to learn about what's going on here in terms of education and to bring this message to educators here.
Yeah, totally agree with that. And first, I was reading your book, and I was so amazed. How much time did you spend visiting schools, classrooms, and being with teachers? Why you start visiting teachers, trying to understand their mastery? Why education, Natalie, from a journalist?
Well, yeah, I felt, since I'm not a teacher myself, that was the only way for me to really understand what was going on, was to visit classrooms. But I got interested in writing about education maybe 12 or 13 years ago now. I live in Washington, D.C., and there's a lot of education reform activity going on there, and it seemed really important. I was particularly interested, not just in Washington, D.C., but throughout the United States. There's what we call sometimes the achievement gap. It's basically a gap in test scores, so reading test scores, math test scores, between students at the lower and higher end of the socioeconomic spectrum. And we've been trying for many years to narrow that gap, but it's not working. It's only actually getting wider by some estimates. And so I wanted to write about this, partly, just to satisfy my own curiosity, and also it seemed incredibly important. I started just visiting schools with groups of, philanthropists and policymakers, so they would take them to schools. And then I decided, well, I have a background in journalism, so there's not enough coverage of what's going on in all these different schools, so I'll just start writing about it. And maybe I'll figure this out through writing about it, because that is often how I figure things out. And this knowledge issue is something I just came across by accident. So I thought, well, I need to get into schools to figure out what's going on. And it seemed, and many people thought, the real problem was the high schools, that's where everything falls apart for some reason. So I volunteered to tutor students in writing at a high school in Washington, D.C., in a very high poverty area. Wasn't the worst high school in Washington, but mostly kids from poor families. And the first thing I discovered was I thought I would help them with their writing for class, but they didn't have any writing assignments for class. And then I figured out why, because when I asked them to write for me, they didn't know how to write. No one had ever taught them. They didn't understand the concept of a sentence. But the other thing that I noticed, so I would give them things to read, because I wanted them, it wasn't creative writing. I wanted them they all wanted to go to college. They're not going to be asked to write poems in college. So I wanted them to read something and write in response to it. So I brought them something to read. One thing was, I used to work as a historian of the United States Supreme Court. So that's something I know about. So I wrote something about the Supreme Court. And none of them knew what the Supreme Court was. And at the time, the school was 17 blocks away from the Supreme Court, but they really hadn't heard of it. And I couldn't understand this. I mean, they were perfectly intelligent, but they just didn't know some basic things about the world. And the vocabulary was also, sometimes they would know a word, but sometimes they wouldn't. So I gave one student, I had come across the writing revolution method, which we can talk about later, but one student was interested in the baseball player, Jackie Robinson. So I thought, okay, I'll give him these 3 sentences. Jackie Robinson was a great baseball player because Jackie Robinson, not a great baseball, was an admirable person. Because Jackie Robinson was an admirable person, but Jackie Robinson was an admirable person, so. And he just sat there for a while, and finally he looked up and he said, what does admirable mean? And he was maybe 16 years old, and so I didn't understand, why don't these kids know what I consider pretty basic facts, vocabulary? And I asked the teacher I was sort of working with, an English teacher, I said, I don't understand it. They're in 10th grade. What have they been doing for the last 10 years? And he said, we ask ourselves that question all the time. So he didn't know, and I didn't know. But then I read an article about this method of writing instruction in a magazine, and I ended up meeting the woman who created the method. Her name was Judith Hochman. And this method taught writing skills and also deepened content knowledge at the same time. And I thought, oh, that's what my kids need. I was also on the board of a charter school in DC, which is a school that's publicly financed but sort of independently run. And I said to Judy Hochman, this was an elementary school, this charter school. I would love my school to adopt this method of writing instruction. Could you go and see, could they do that? And she came back to me and said, well, the problem is this method of writing instruction only works if it's embedded in content, and your school isn't teaching any content. And I said, what do you mean? It's a school. What are they doing? And I was on the school performance committee. I mean, I'd been in classrooms, but I didn't understand what I was looking at. And I realized a lot of other people didn't understand this either. And so I started looking into what schools were doing, and I wasn't the first one to come across this problem, but I thought I knew a lot about education, and I'd never heard anyone talk about it. So I discovered there was a group of people, like E.D. Hirsch and his disciples, who were very concerned about this problem and had been for decades. But I realized they were really just talking to each other. It had been written about, but in kind of a dry academic way. And I thought, well, this really needs to get into the public conversation about education. And maybe if somebody writes a book that's more of a journalistic, narrative account, maybe that would help. And so that's what happened.
So again, an invitation for you all to start reading the Knowledge Gap, because you're going to have details on the things that you discovered. And one thing that you discovered was teachers doing or trying to doing their best teaching skills, because for them, and actually for me, when I was teaching, was an important thing. A personal note, I did actually a master trying to understand the relevance of skills and how you can teach skills. And that's the reason why for many educators here, Robert Schwartz, David Perkins are names that are important, particularly in Chile, because the skill-based learning is something that we are trying to push in our schools, And I see faces saying, yeah, it's true, This thing. So, but when I was reading your book, I remembered my classes when my students were engaged, were classes when they had something to play with skills, something to do with skills.
Yeah.
What do you think about it?
Well, of course, I mean, skills, it sounds wonderful. And we do want kids to have all sorts of skills, but we have to recognize that they're pure skills, like riding a bike or playing tennis. It doesn't matter what bike you're riding, you can ride the bike. And it's true also with decoding words. You learn those skills in the abstract, more or less, and you can apply them generally to anything you're reading to sound out words. But other things that we call skills are not like that. So in the United States, there's a lot of emphasis on reading comprehension skills. That's what our tests seem to measure. And so the schools, especially in elementary school through about age 14 or so, students are practicing these skills, and the idea is it doesn't matter what they're reading or whether they're really retaining any factual information or acquiring knowledge. As long as they get good at something like finding the main idea, they'll be able to apply that. And they're practicing this on texts, books that are on random topics or maybe just fiction, and written at a level they can read on their own. So not if they might be in 6th grade, but they might be reading a 3rd grade level book, because the idea is, well, if you just keep practicing the skill, you'll get to the 6th grade level. But these skills like finding the main idea, making inferences, critical thinking, all of these things, they're not pure skills that you can learn in the abstract and just practice them and then you can apply them generally. Whether you can find the main idea, make an inference, think critically about something depends a lot on the topic and how much you know about the topic. But with reading comprehension, I'd say it's not that you can only understand text on topics you already know about. It's going to be easier. But of course, eventually we want kids to be able to read, understand, and think critically about texts on topics they don't already know about. But for that, you need a critical mass of general academic knowledge and vocabulary, and, this is sometimes overlooked, familiarity with the complex syntax of written language. And so how do you acquire those general kinds of knowledge that enable you to apply the skills? Really only through learning about a lot of specific topics, because those things you don't learn them in the abstract. They don't stick in long-term memory without a meaningful context. So the way to those general kinds of skills is through learning a lot about a lot of topics and not just memorizing facts. I mean, I think learning has to start there. I know, at least in the United States, memorize, that's become a bad word. You can't say it. So I say retain information. Whatever you want to call it, that's where it has to start. And then, of course, you guide kids to think about that information, to analyze it through asking the right kinds of questions and having them write about it, not to be forgotten, writing. And eventually they become able to think critically and write about a lot of different topics.
And from that diagnosis that you did, and you can, again, if you read the book, you're going to see this. In some moment, you talk about this kind of approach in the curriculum, that you can find some approaches more on skills, like curriculum based on skills, and curriculum based on knowledge. That is correct, that is real. That you can see, particularly in American educational system, there is a curriculum with this approach on skills, and what are the implications on that in the classroom that you visit?
Yeah, I mean, again, there's skills and skills. So what's very common, what's typical in the United States is a reading. So we just teach pretty much reading and math. Certainly in elementary school. There may be half an hour in the schedule at the end of the day for history, social studies, science, but often that time ends up being used for reading and math because those are the only subjects that are tested. And for reading, and the average amount of time on reading, at least that the schools report, is 2 hours a day, but often it's 2.5, 3 hours a day, especially where test scores are low. And so the curriculum is designed to boost test scores. The tests seem to be testing abstract skills like finding the main idea of a text on a topic you've never seen before, you don't know anything about. The texts, reading passages on these tests are random, and they are not on anything that kids might have learned in school. They're designed to avoid those topics because the idea is, well, we're not testing their content knowledge, we're testing their general comprehension ability. And so that is what teaching, what the curriculum has come to look like. We want to prepare kids for these tests. We have them practice what they're supposed to do on the test. So we give them random passages, random books to read, or just excerpts. And this week, the skill we're working on is making inferences. So you just read these various books and practice that skill. Next week, it's comparing and contrasting. And this leaves kids very unprepared for high school, because suddenly in high school, they're expected to know lots of things about the world. They get a textbook on world history, but they may not have learned the difference between a country and a continent, or in the United States, a city and a state. They don't know where the United States is on a map of the world. I mean, this is very well documented. People don't like to talk about it. And it's not just kids from poor families. I have heard this from teachers themselves. My kids don't know anything, you know, and so it is most obvious in kids, though, who are coming from families that are not highly educated, because the kids whose parents are highly educated are better able to pick up this kind of knowledge of the world at home. And also maybe the parents have enough money to take them to Europe, or, you know, so they pick up that kind of information about the world more or less naturally. But the other kids, they rely on school for it, and all they're getting is this steady diet of empty, really, skills. And so they get to high school, and that's why it looks like everything is falling apart in high school, but those problems don't begin in high school.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how, and I guess you are also realizing some decisions that you have made in the past regarding how you teach skills or knowledge. But recently you put this article in Forbes saying to teachers that you don't need to choose knowledge or skills. Actually, you can teach both, but depends on the objective, depends on the purpose. How you explain that, please?
Yeah, I became aware that there was, some people were saying, well, that I and others who advocate for knowledge building curriculum were saying that means no skills. You can't ever ask kids to make an inference or find the main idea. You have to choose one or the other, and that's just not true. What you need to do is combine them, and what's important is what is in the foreground. So if you put skills in the foreground, then you're just trying to teach the skill of comparing and contrasting, and you choose, the teacher reads aloud a book. Sometimes it's not even a book. I've been in classrooms where first the teacher has two kids stand at the front of the room, and they're wearing different clothes. And let's practice comparing and contrasting. She's got a skirt, and he's got a pair of pants, you know. Okay, now go and practice that skill on texts, on, you know, what doesn't matter what you're reading as long as you're practicing comparing and contrasting. So that is unlikely to work. But I've also been in a second grade classroom where they were learning about, let's say, Athens and Sparta. They were learning about ancient Greece. And the teacher said, so let's talk about what was different between Athens and Sparta. How were they similar and how were they different? So she's asking them to compare and contrast, but not because she's trying to teach the skill of comparing and contrasting, because she wants them to think about Athens and Sparta, about the text that she read, this is second grade, so she read aloud a series of stories and texts about ancient Greece. So they knew a lot about ancient Greece, and they were actually able to answer that question when she said, let's compare Athens and Sparta. But nobody said, okay, now we're practicing the skill of comparing and contrasting. And by the way, this was a classroom where they were still doing, in addition to using this knowledge building curriculum, they were also doing this leveled reading and practicing the skills part of the day. And so I think it was the same day, she was working with a small group, and they were practicing the skill of comparing and contrasting, and they were reading a simple story that was comparing Thanksgiving, the holiday Thanksgiving, in the United States and Canada. And the big difference the kids were supposed to get was that in the United States, we celebrate Thanksgiving in November, and in Canada, they celebrate Thanksgiving in October. None of the kids in this small group got that difference. They all missed that. But they had just been comparing Athens and Sparta, no problem. And I think they were just bored by the story about Thanksgiving, and they weren't really paying much attention. So.
Regarding this pedagogical approach of teaching knowledge using the skills, I remember one of the cognitive science principles or learning science principles about deepening meaning of learning. So students need to think about the meaning of the things that they are learning. You know, there's one big principle, and Daniel Willingham, you know, put a lot of effort trying to disseminate these ideas. So let's move to the learning science part of this conversation. I know you have been investigating, reading about this, and and you also mentioned in your book this experiment, this baseball experiment. So let's start talking about that baseball experiment, and then move to why why teachers need to know about science of learning. So go ahead.
So the baseball experiment, well, when I give presentations in the United States, I don't know if this would work here, it might. I tell people, I'm just going to show you a paragraph from a newspaper, and I'm going to ask you to find the main idea, and I'm sure you're all expert readers, so this won't be a challenge. And then I show them a paragraph, I don't tell them this, it's taken from a British newspaper, and it's describing a cricket match. And nobody can understand, I can't understand it. I once spent 45 minutes Googling all of the words in that paragraph that I didn't understand, and I still didn't understand the paragraph. And then I say, well, this is something cognitive psychologists have known about for a long time. So the baseball experiment is just one of many experiments showing the important role of knowledge in comprehension. This was done in the late 1980s. A couple of researchers in the United States, they took a group of 7th and 8th graders. They chose the topic of baseball. They wanted to know what is more important to reading comprehension. Is it general skill, like finding the main idea, or is it how much you know about the topic? And they chose the topic of baseball because they figured there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they divided them into 4 groups depending on how much they knew about baseball and how well they had scored on a standardized reading comprehension test. And then they gave them all a passage to read describing a baseball game, part of a baseball game, and tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was what really made the difference to comprehension was how much a kid knew about baseball. So the kids who were poor readers according to the test, but they knew a lot about baseball, they did much better than the good readers, according to the test, who didn't know much about baseball. So when they knew a lot about the topic, these poor comprehenders had no trouble comprehending the passage. And I think it's a very powerful illustration of the power of knowledge.
Yeah, actually, yeah, it's true. And again, because when you are designing and deciding where the way that you will teach their knowledge, you can use strategies to dipping in the meaning of the information that you are.
But I didn't answer the second part of your question, which is why is knowledge of the topic or any prior relevant knowledge so helpful to comprehension? And that has to do with working memory, which is the aspect of our consciousness where we are taking in new information and trying to understand it. And the important thing about working memory is it's very limited in its capacity. So it's been found it can only hold maybe 4 or 5 items of new information for about 20 seconds before it starts to get overwhelmed and we start to lose the ability to understand what we're trying to take in. And of course, if you're not yet a fluent reader, then the decoding and where do you put the emphasis in the sentence is an additional burden on working memory, in addition to the new information you're trying to take in. The way around those limitations on working memory is long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. And so if we can just withdraw information when we need it, relevant information, then we don't need to juggle that in working memory, and that opens up more capacity in working memory to take in new information. So if you're reading about baseball, for example, and you already know what a double play is, which I don't, so don't ask me, but you don't have to think about that term. You don't have to go look it up. You can just attend to whatever, the new information, to the meaning of what you're trying to read. And so the more information about the world, and especially academic kinds of information, because that's the kind of information that's often assumed in written text, the more of that kind of knowledge you have stored in long-term memory, the greater your capacity to understand almost anything you try to read.
And anything else from the science of learning, principles or evidence that you think we should know before or actually during our teaching practices or decisions?
Well, there's a lot that, unfortunately in the United States and elsewhere, teachers during their training don't learn a lot about what scientists have discovered about what works in learning. But there are many things, so deliberate practice, for example, and which is not just doing the same thing over and over again, but acquiring a skill. And I apply this when I talk to writing. If you deliberate practice means you take a teacher takes a complex process, divides it into manageable chunks for a student, and then provides practice for the student, with whatever aspect of the process the student needs. Practice plus feedback, prompt targeted feedback, and then when the student has mastered that chunk of the process, moving on to the next chunk of the process, because it's not about making things really easy for students. You don't want to overwhelm working memory, but you want them to have what are called desirable difficulties. You want them to use that working memory capacity on things that will further their learning, because there is no learning without effort. So that's one thing from cognitive science, but also things like retrieval practice. So this is the way we really strengthen a knowledge and long-term memory, is by practicing retrieving an item of information. And the more you practice retrieving that item of information, the more likely you are to be able to get it when you need it. And by the way, writing is an excellent method of retrieval practice. It's spaced practice, not doing something all at the same time, but spacing out the learning and going back to things that you've done in the past. But I will say, so there's this wonderful body of cognitive science out there that can be very helpful for teachers. But I have noticed that those who write about cognitive science, and I just finished a great book by Stanislaw Stein called How We Learn.
How We Learn.
I think what they don't take account of is that many teachers, at least in the United States, they're not actually teaching any substance. And none of this will work unless you are actually teaching, content, history, geography. If you have kids just use retrieval practice to remember the definition, this is one of the reading comprehension skills. This might be my least favorite reading comprehension skill, determining the author's purpose. And you only have 3 choices. It's PIE, to persuade, to inform, or entertain. Supposedly authors only do one of those things at the same time. And so if you use retrieval practice to help kids memorize that definition, you're not really advancing their learning, because it's really not going to be very helpful to them. So you have to start with a content-rich curriculum and then use all of these techniques, these strategies from cognitive science to help students acquire the knowledge.
And I love that you are talking about, in a way, some misconceptions or misunderstanding that educators can have about science of learning and the principles of practice. Like, we can, by default, we can turn practices from learnings of science as the way that we use strategies, but if we forget content, the problem is there too. What other kind of misunderstanding, misconceptions we need to be aware of or avoid when we try to apply the cognitive science principles in the classroom?
Well, I think a basic problem in the United States is the idea that teachers really shouldn't teach very much, that we should let kids discover things for themselves, and that works better. And it's been found there's a lot of research showing that no, when learners are new to a topic, it works much better to explicitly, directly teach them the information. That doesn't mean that you lecture to 6-year-olds. I mean, you can teach a lot through telling a story, reading a story that has information in it, but also asking questions. That's part of explicit teaching. You want to engage students, but you don't just say, okay, now figure this all out for yourself. I think that is part of the attraction for American teachers to teaching just reading comprehension skills and strategies, because they've been trained to believe that they shouldn't stand in front of a group of kids and actually impart information, that's kind of a waste of time. but they can feel like, well, I'm not just, it's this idea of the banking,
Yep.
that you're just filling kids' brains with these facts and they're going to get bored. Of course, they're often not bored at all. They're often really engaged. Young children, is this a problem?
You can use mine.
Okay. Young children often get very excited about learning about facts, but teachers have been led to believe that they'll be bored, they won't be interested, it'll be too hard for them, and they can feel, if I'm teaching them how to do something like find the main idea, I'm giving them the skills that they can use to discover information for themselves. And eventually, yes, they will be, they should be doing that, discovering that information for themselves, but when they're 6 years old, or when they're 16 years old and it's a topic they know nothing about, it's going to be a very inefficient way of acquiring knowledge.
We are ending this part of the conversation, so be prepared with your questions. One last piece, because this conversation, the title of this conversation was 21st century skills. So what kind of approach do you recommend when educators, actually policymakers, are trying to push in the conversation this idea of developing 21st century skills? What recommendations, what kind of approach we can be aware of?
Well, of course, I don't know what the situation is like here in Chile, but in the United States, I think it's important, there has to be both a top-down effort and also from the bottom up. I mean, you can't just tell teachers, do this thing, do something different. This is what policymakers, administrators have been doing for generations. My mother was a teacher, and what teachers can do is, if it doesn't make sense to them, they just close the door and they do what does make sense to them. So you have to make sure that this new approach makes sense to teachers and to sort of bring them along and not tell them why things need to change and not just change things. But also, I think it's important for teachers and to understand why, to understand the science and the science of learning, et cetera. But I don't think that's enough to enable them to translate the science into effective classroom practice. And what we desperately need in the United States is a curriculum that is grounded in the science of learning, that can guide. It's not necessarily a script that you have to follow with complete fidelity, but it is too much to ask every individual teacher to figure out how to translate the science of learning into what they're doing in the classroom. They really, teachers need that guide. They need, the materials to work with. And once they understand why the materials are put together the way they are, of course, they can add their own touches. They definitely need to be able to adapt the materials to the needs of their individual students. And what helps with that is we have in the United States now instructional coaches. So somebody who's observing and not, not to say you're fired if you don't do this right, but to say, I noticed you did this, next time maybe you could try that, or don't spend as much time on this point, go more quickly to that point. So all of those things. And I will say that, so in the United States, we do not have a national curriculum or even national standards. But we do have now maybe 6 or 8 knowledge building curricula that none of them are perfect, but any of them is better than this skills-focused approach that has been so typical. And they are spreading. One problem in the United States is we don't have good information, good data on what schools are using what curriculum. Even states don't know sometimes what curricula are being used. But judging from the number of speaking engagement requests I'm getting and other things, I think it's still a minority of schools that are using this new approach, but it's a growing minority.
Now, last idea on that, and I want your thoughts. So if we move from reading class trying to combine knowledge and some very good strategies and move to a more kind of general approach, like pushing our kids to develop these 21st century skills, in both scenarios, you will say that they need knowledge, like practicing or trying to develop like communication skills or collaborative skills. Yeah. The necessity, the need of app-based knowledge is the same, no?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just take communication skills. What are you communicating? I mean, if you can't, and I think the most difficult communication skill is writing, but it also carries over to oral language. But you can't do an effective job of communicating about a topic you don't really know something about. So it's the same problem. And these skills, it's not that they're unimportant, it's just that you can't teach them in the abstract. They can only grow alongside knowledge, expanding kids' knowledge.
Okay, thanks so much. That was my part of this. Bueno, ¿qué tal? Sí, muy bien. Muchas gracias.